So we've talked a little bit about what closure could have been. It could have been a written reflection in their notebooks about these, or it could have been a
public conversation.
A conversation about the who's right exercise. It could have been a written, kind of an exit ticket type of deal. Same problem, you've seen this before. This is not a memory test. This is a now that you've done other, what do you think now?
Right.
You can even have kids, I used to think this, now I think, or this is how I thought about it before class, now I know that, as a way to structure that type of reflection. Generalization statements. I feel like we've come up with some samples of that.
Yeah, I do.
An aspect of that that connects back to the who's right conversation. Well, let's go to that question. The who's right conversation that didn't go the way you anticipated. You wondered whether or not it had the access that kids needed. You wondered if it was the right start. What information do they need? And was there a way to bring in other representation? Talk a little bit about what you anticipated and what happened instead.
I hoped that as they started looking at those, they would be able to give each other more reasons about where they, like what would work and why not, and why. So this idea that if this is a quadratic formula problem, oh, we're doing that because look, it has an x equals in it. And that level of really checking out what was going on or where it was headed, I didn't hear as much. Or when we start with a quadratic equation, and it is z equal to 0, what's our next step? How do we solve an x squared problem? So I guess maybe I could have activated some of that by asking them to think about their own first step before giving them 3 choices, so that they'd made a little bit more sense of what this language was in the initial problem. This is where this kind of question is where as a class we've worked most recently, but also I think where they've had a lot of questions coming up for themselves. And so they're very confident with their factoring, and I almost wonder if I'd flipped the two. I felt like the second conversation they were able to dig into more quickly and have more ideas around it. So in that second conversation, I wonder if that's simply because they had gotten familiar with the structure again, which we haven't used a who's right structure in quite some time, or if it was actually that the factoring was somehow easier for them to make sense of, and if starting with that, the way they talked about this would have changed. They talked about the solve the equation
Developmentally,
problem.
in the last weeks, this was first. And so maybe you're right. Maybe this was more sort of comfortable for them, and so switching them up as a possibility.
Putting this first for me, I was thinking that they tend to talk better about stuff they perceive as harder. So in this particular class, if they think, oh, it's not worth talking about, then it gets us off to a very slow start. So I was thinking give them something a little bit weirder first and then move back to their comfort zone to model. This is another way to look at it and think about it.
Wow. So, and that actually happened, didn't it? Because this is where they got stuck, and then once you were ready to move on, you said, I'm going to do this one a little bit quicker, and sure enough, they were more comfortable with it. So there's reasons to do it that way. Just a clarifying question, you said they may have had questions about what the language means. Where? Do you remember that? You just now said. You said they may have had questions around the language?
Well, they just didn't look. I don't know how many of them read and internalized what the question itself was. So the problem that these 3 students were arguing about was solve this equation for x. And I don't know, like given at the end they said, oh, well, you're finding the x-intercepts, and they were really clear that we were finding x-intercepts. It seemed like they'd forgotten what the original prompt was. And as soon as we looked back there, my sense was more kids were like saying, oh, no, it's just this one.
I want to talk about language. I have a suggestion that you might consider. I think it would also help with, you've named that this is conceptually slightly more complicated for them. I wonder what what would happen if you had something of a name everything that's on the page level of the exercise. So before, your comment is they didn't give the kinds of reasons, or that you wanted them to give each other more reasons. And I'm suggesting that before they can give reasons for anything, they need to know what they're reasoning about and have names for what they're reasoning about. So what are the things on this page that we can name? An equation.
We've got an equation. We've got a generic rectangle and a quadratic formula.
I'm not going to write them down, let's just brainstorm them. You've got a solving.
We have balancing an equation or doing the same thing to both sides.
You said quadratic formula already with the radical sign or the square root sign.
They might use the term coefficients.
Coefficients, you have your A, your B, your C.
We're factoring here. We're
So
finding
what
a
I'm
length and
suggesting
width.
is if kids had names for everything that was in front of them, and I think naming things is a way to engage them kind of at that first level. If they could sort of identify and have a name to associate with a symbol on the page, then they might be able to say, yeah, those are the symbols that I know, or those are the ones that I don't know, or they might be able to say, oh, those are the things that I use when, or they might be able to say, Katie's doing this because, and they might then be able to have access into the reasoning kinds of statements that you're wondering about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm trying to picture whether that's something that gets built in this activity or that I've needed to lay more groundwork for over time. And I think maybe it's both.
Maybe both. Over time, what does that look like to you?
A lot of the way the curriculum develops, the students are doing lots of things with their constructed language around it, or language that's not different math vocabulary. So this generic rectangle is finding a length and width and an area or a product, but not always factors and products. Just as an example, like that language tends to come in later, or now at the end. And so it's perhaps previewing that language and using it more interchangeably earlier in the unit, particularly in this additional class, to give students more and different access where they may not have those at the tip of their tongue in the same way because they're concentrating their attention in other places.
You've heard me mention word walls before. Word banks, words of the day. You could use the formal language that you're referring to and have that list there on the wall, on the whiteboard, on an overhead. Especially on the wall or the whiteboard, to have it there as a bank of words that they might want to name drop. And then the exercise, if you felt there was time, the exercise, real time for them is, you each have a paper in front of you, here it is on the overhead, name as many things that you see on this paper as you can, the very thing that we just did. And I'm guessing that when they name, they'll at times go to their transitional vocabulary, their own sort of, oh yeah, we did this yesterday in math class. And then you can, certain times, connect it to the formal language, and certain times just embrace that's the transitional language that they're comfortable with at the time. But those, using a combination of here's the formal language that we're developing over time with the specifics of everyone in the room needs to engage with these symbols on the page. Here's your, you could even set it up as a pair activity. Remember you said you need to be able to see this. You and your partner didn't need to be able to see this paper. You could say, take 30 seconds and come up for names for as many things on this paper as you can. And you could do a whip around some type of just, as fast as we can, let's get words out. I think that level of words out, this, let's get some words on our tongues, gets a few kids just to be engaged with the page at that level. Then when you say, so who's right? Not only are they hooked by the problem, but they have the words to begin to say, this is why I think it's A, B, or C. So that was one thing you might work on is the vocabulary, and I love the way you've identified some of it's transitional and some of it's trying to use the formal vocabulary.